Elizabeth Mitchell is with the Daily Signal, and she joins us, as well as others, today on our Saturday, March 8th weekend edition of the Armstrong-Williams Show. Elizabeth, California Governor Gavin Newsom, a pioneer for LGBTQ rights, who decades ago led the California March of making it legal for same-sex marriages, did something shocking. He suggested a few days ago that Democrats were in the wrong in allowing transgender athletes to participate in female college and youth sports. Let me read a quote from the governor and get your thoughts on it. I think it's an issue of fairness. I completely think it's just wrong. It's deeply unfair, Newsom said in his debut podcast episode of the Gavin Newsom podcast. I am not wrestling with the fairness issue. I totally agree. It's wrong. Elizabeth, your take.
I, of course, agree that it is unfair to allow transgender identifying males to compete against women in sports. We know that not only is it unsafe, but it is unfair. I think this was really highlighted in Trump's joint address to Congress just a few days ago, in which he showed a young girl who had a severe concussion and brain bleeding as a result of a transgender identifying male spiking a ball at her head. So I think that it totally is something that states should take a lead on outlawing in accordance with the executive order.
But Andrew Donaldson with Young Voice says Gavin Newsom has been the biggest champion of this issue. Are the Democrats finally waking up and not being out of touch finally with the American people?
The ones that want to run for president do, and it's been a very poorly kept secret that Gavin Newsom has wanted to be president for a very long time. He's going to do some course correction here. He's very smart. Remember, he's from the California system, and you have to be, to use a football term, a kind of a system quarterback to become high office in California. And he saw what his colleague and friend Kamala Harris went through, where she had a hard time adjusting to a national dialogue because she came up through that California system where you only have to please the Democratic Party. And that's it. And you don't have to do a lot of reaching across, and you don't have to do a lot of being non-tone deaf on cultural issues, whatever they may be. So I think he's a smart guy. I think he's calibrating. I think he's running. I think that's the big answer here.
Patrice, Onwuka, the Grand Old Party budget goals, the budget office is saying are impossible without Medicare and Medicaid cuts.
Yeah, good to see everybody. I think the challenge with the House budget that was passed, I think we'll be trying to cut the spending. Now, if you look at the details, there are some kind of fail-safes to say, you know what, the tax cuts, for example, the $4.5 trillion to extend the Trump tax cuts would have to be offset by those spending cuts. Now, when we talk about spending cuts, where are we cutting? We're cutting discretionary spending, but also looking at the entitlement programs for waste, fraud, and abuse. And so can you find enough pennies, dollars, and frankly, stacks of money when it comes to Medicaid, where there is rampant fraud and waste, but particularly fraud when you look at the number of people who are receiving Medicaid benefits but should not be, or frankly are overbilling, people who are committing flagrant examples of fraud. So I think that's where Republicans and working with DOJ is really trying to zero in on where can you do the cuts that are needed without really touching benefits specifically to people who are receiving it. That said, you have to question whether people who are receiving it should be receiving it, and that's not a question that should be ignored either.
Scott?
Well, you don't have enough time for me to wax on about DOJ and the credibility and integrity of those cuts. Let me say that. Let me say this. The Republicans can play and adjust Medicaid and Social Security benefits if they want. Until you show me empirical data that says fraud, waste, and abuse is rampant in Medicaid and Social Security, then you're just giving me some political talking points or rhetoric. For example, in the Social Security benefit area, these statistics, which Donald Trump used very effectively in his speech a couple nights ago, let me just say this. Show me the data that says someone that is calculated out to be 300 years old was actually getting benefits. You see, there are two parts to it. Yes, the charts show that, but secondly, show me where those benefits were paid. And you're not going to be able to come up with that data. The second point I'll make, and then I'll end, is there's a big difference between fraud, waste, and abuse. As a former prosecutor, as a criminal defense lawyer right now, I know a lot about this space. If you don't like a political program, if you don't like the programs under U.S. aid, right, then that's not fraud, waste, and abuse because you don't like it. If it's fraud, waste, and abuse, that means people are intentionally doing something, either malfeasance or misfeasance. That's not the case here. They just don't like us promoting condoms in the Congo in Africa, which has the highest rate of spread of AIDS, and they don't see that that's really important for us to help that country because we don't want the spread of AIDS to any country. And so let's draw that line of demarcation and be fair about it. And right now, Donald Trump is getting rid of programs and DOE and people because he doesn't like what they represent. They don't fit his politics, but that's not fraud, waste, and abuse.
So, Raynard, I need your wisdom here on a very important issue. I hark back to the days when, during former President Obama's State of the Union, Joe Wilson stood and called him a liar. I hark back to as recent as when Biden was speaking, and Marjorie Taylor Greene and Boebert were very rude. Now, let's fast forward to the President's State of the Union just past Tuesday night, and the House just voted to censor Texas Congressman Al Green for his disruption on the House floor during the President's speech. What is the standard? What is the bar? And was this the right move, considering the past actions of others in that should be a respectful body?
Well, what you're saying, Armstrong, unfortunately, a debasing of our culture, our values, our society. There was a time when the president spoke before Congress. Whether you agreed with him or not, you were respectful of the office and of his being president. Now everyone is caught up in this social media, TikTok, 10-second soundbite, and the more incendiary you are, the more viral your video goes. And Exhibit A in that is Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, Democrat from Dallas. You listen to her, Armstrong, she's using four-letter words on live TV, thinking it's going to ingratiate her to the American people. But the problem with the Democrats is they're good on the theatrics, but we know what they're against. Tell me what you're for.
But you're not really answering my question. Should Congressman Green, given the past history of others, should he have been censored?
Oh, yeah, without
What was
question.
different about this time?
Well, number one, he was warned and he kept going. Mm-hmm. Then he's raising his cane in a threatening manner in front of the President of the United States. So I think he took it to a whole nother level that the other people, they just verbally interrupted his speech. He stood up, waved his cane, and refused to leave the House floor. That's different.
Let me come back to Ms. Mitchell. There is an executive order that the President will probably have already signed by the time this show airs, eliminating the Department of Education. What does that mean?
This is something that President Trump has said throughout his campaign and has stayed with now that he is the president, that the Department of Education is full of what DOJ has called waste, fraud, and abuse, and that a lot of the things that it is doing really could be handled on the state level. The State Department of Education would continue and would provide support to public schools in the states. But he has said that it really is necessary to have Secretary Linda McMahon. Her job is kind of to put herself out of work. So I think that's something he's promised to do, and look forward to seeing how it really takes place. It's interesting to see what mechanisms would really work for dismantling such an established department.
I'm going to come back to you, but Andrew, a judge ruled against the president's funding freeze, saying, quote, "You put yourself above Congress."
Yeah, and you're going to see this with the Department of Education thing you just said. Every time we do one of these executive orders and it involves Congress, it's going to wind up in the courts. A lot of this hopefully will get Supreme Court, because that's going to be ultimate authority, and you're just going to have a bunch of sound bites over different federal judges going forth of it. But what we're really having here is a live action play on how our government functions. Congress is supposed to have the power of the purse. The executive is supposed to have their delineated power, and the Supreme Court has its delineated power. And what we're having here is, after decades and decades of executive authority getting pushed and pushed and pushed, and frankly, Congress, bipartisan for decades now, not really doing their job and hounding what they're supposed to do, this is where we're at. So we're going to have this live action brawl for all over what kind of a government we have. Does congressional funding have to be pushed through by the executive? Can the executive just come back and arbitrarily change it? Can you get rid of a department that Congress can? This is actually really important foundational stuff. We're putting it in the partisan stuff of the moment. But really, what we're watching is a defining of what our government is through the three branches of government.
And it sounds as though Trump is listening, because we just heard that he decided to rescind, for now, issuing his executive order to dismantle the Department of Education, Andrew.
Yeah, and remember, we have a kind of a history of how Donald Trump does things. He says the outrageous thing, he pushes the outrageous thing, then everybody reacts, and then there's an adjustment to it. There's a double down, and then we kind of get to wherever we're actually going to go. That's part of his negotiating style. That's part of his leadership style. So almost all these, like the tariffs, now we're on a 30-day pause. 30 days from now, about 2 weeks from now, we'll probably have an agreement or adjustment on that. So you got to be very careful with the reaction to, we're going to get rid of the Department of Education, which is something that a lot of people agree needs reformed. But are you going to reform the bureaucracy of it, or are you going to take a hatchet to the whole thing and get rid of it? I suspect that he's not going to get rid of it, but he can start there, and then you negotiate, well, I got rid of 20%, 30%, 40%. Then he calls it a win. It's important to keep that cycle of information and the way Donald Trump does things in mind here.
And this is the Armstrong-Williams Show. It's Saturday, March 8th, and we'll be back.
The gentleman, because he
And welcome back to the broadcast. You know, we wanted to set up so many topics that we want to discuss today. We're going to come back to them, but I must introduce one more topic to Ms. Onwuka. You know, Putin played the long game, Ms. Onwuka, and it's finally paying off for him. The Kremlin is actually absolutely shocked at the tone of this White House over the last 3 weeks.
Not surprising, because this is a very different White House than the Biden White House. And so I think we all saw with bated breath watching with Volodymyr Zelensky and President Trump having what should have been a very simple signing of a mineral rights deal and just a handshake turn into a heated shouting match over whether there is going to be a negotiated end and what that end should look like. And so while I think Russia and Putin may feel like, okay, the United States is on their side, I would hesitate to say that. I think it's going to come down to what sanctions get put on Russia, what Russia is allowed to keep after this deal, whatever it is negotiated, this treaty gets negotiated, what they end up with, and frankly, how we move going forward. That said, I'm sure they do feel very encouraged to see that Zelensky has had to come back and beg on social media with apologies to the United States and with a number of statements about sincere gratitude for the money that's been given, and frankly, to see how quickly the spigot from the United States to Ukraine could be turned off when it comes to the arms and the money that funds their continued campaign against Russia.
I want to come back to the question I asked Mr. Jackson about Congressman Al Green being censored. What I did not mention was, Scott, 100 Democrats voted along with the Republicans to censor him.
Yeah, I certainly sympathize with Congressman Al Green and his frustration with the lies that were being told during the joint session, the speech. At the same time, though, and he certainly was yelling and screaming about Medicaid and the Trump basically misleading, arguing that they weren't going to touch benefits. There's no way you're going to cut $800 billion from Medicaid without touching benefits, because you're going to have to be able to find it. And it's just not, it lacks credibility, and it lacks, good faith if you're going to make that political argument. At the same time, though, while I sympathize with him, decorum, and as my mother used to say, couth. That boy ain't got no couth. Well, he kind of took it over the top, and I think the Democrats are really frustrated right now with having no power, but they also saw, the Democratic leadership put out a memo hours before the speech and said, let's maintain my decorum, let's listen, let's be respectful. And that was the right thing to do for Hakeem Jeffries. At the same time, at least one Democratic member of the House didn't agree, and I do think he took it too far. But at the same time, he's censored now. That's a public rebuke. That's okay, and he'll take that. Now, he'll go raise money on that, because your earlier question was about, where's our decorum? Well, listen, when you can get on social media and you can be thrown off committees and still raise $1 million based on your voice and not being heard and not being in any power, you're going to have these types of instances.
There's a bigger issue here, though, Raynard, and it's the fact is that Trump probably gave one of the best speeches of his presidency, the first, and of course this one. CBS polls showed 77% of Americans agree with him. A CNN poll shows 76% of Americans agreed with him, unheard of. So obviously, the Democrats are not showing sympathy to the cancer victims, to the daughters and the mother that lost the father and the husband, the 95-year-old mother that Trump promised would bring her son home from Russia. Obviously, you may not want to applaud Trump and give any encouragement to Trump, but when you look at the optics, you're not celebrate a cancer survivor. That did not go well with their base.
Yeah, the Democrats lost. Even Democrats thought it was a bridge too far, number one. Number two, I think, Armstrong, the biggest loser from Tuesday night was Hakeem Jeffries. Why? He sent out that memo Scott rightfully talked about to show decorum, and Al Green, congressman from Houston, said, I don't care what you say as my leader in the Democratic caucus. Do you think he would have done that if Nancy Pelosi was still minority leader and issued that email? Hakeem Jeffries is weak within the Democratic caucus, and I give him to the end of this year, Armstrong, Hakeem Jeffries will no longer be leader.
Well, thank goodness you're not a Democrat.
Wait a minute,
because you ought to be talking to a Democrat about what's going on in my party.
Scott, we are following the decorum here, and it's working. Let's continue.
I don't have a cane, and I haven't raised it yet.
And we're not raising our voices either.
No, not at all.
Okay, so let me go to Andrew. Andrew, why do you think the Democrats are in disarray, and what is it they need to do to finally attack Trump where they disagree with him and embrace him where they feel they can? Because we do need all three bodies, all three branches of government to keep him in check. Obviously, the Democrats cannot lead in government with anger. They really need a message and a real strategy that can resonate with Americans. Because right now, they really are out in the wilderness, just lost.
Yes, and just to keep peace on the panel, I'm an unaffiliated voter, but I will speak towards our Democratic friends not being in, but of being friendly to them. Look, you can't have that. You're skipping a step. If you don't have leadership, and I mean party-wide leadership, they haven't had effective leadership party-wide for a while. Mentioned she handled her caucus pretty well for a while, but that's just the congressional portion of the Democratic leadership. You don't have a top-down message, and until they find that leader on a national level, this is going to kind of be their plot to fill out. And they've just kind of gotten lost. They have not, after a decade, our Democratic friends, especially the congressional ones, and you saw this in the speech, they haven't figured out how to respond to being trolled yet. And when Donald Trump is the master of this, and the entire media ecosystem that supports him to the letter and lockstep, they haven't really figured out how to respond to that yet. And the cultural stuff has gotten out of the hand with them a little bit. Look, I come from West Virginia. That used to be the land of the Blue Dog Democrats. When I registered to vote in 1998, they didn't ask you which party. Now it's the most Trump state in America. That changed in only 20-some years. That's a huge swing. I think they need to get back to some of that, I hate to use an old term, but the old Blue Dog Democrat stuff where you can be progressive on certain things. You can be progressive on social issues. You can be entitlements and not have the culture stuff get so out of hand that you come off tone deaf when you try to talk to Americans who only tune into politics when they go to vote and they see a hot mess and they go, or I know this guy's chaos, but I'm going to go with that just because I don't like the way that looks. That's the problem they got to figure out. Until you get leadership, I'm not sure they're going to be able to solve that problem, but they will eventually.
Patricia, how did it happen that we were not able to avert a tariff on Canada and Mexico? How did we get to this place?
Well, this was a promise that President Trump made, which is to try to bring some fairer trade to the United States. And when you consider how much tariffs are on U.S. products in other countries, I think he's trying to rebalance that. Now, we've seen that strong arms tactics of saying, okay, we're going to impose tariffs. We've seen countries respond pretty reflexively and pretty quickly. It seems, though, that Mexico, the Mexican presidency seems to be putting up a little bit of a fight and plans to announce some reciprocity and reciprocal tariffs this weekend. And so we'll see how that works. But President Trump is looking back on his Trump 1.0 tariffs. Those were targeted at specific industries, such as the steel industry. And so they weren't widespread and they weren't felt very wide among the broader consumer base. When you consider a lot of the prices did not rise, and then especially considering how inflation skyrocketed under President Biden, and really price levels have not come down, have not filtered back down. And in fact, the inflation rate is rising once again. So I think he's going into the tariffs thinking, okay, they won't have the negative, harsh impacts on consumer spending as maybe that they did, as they didn't have in the past. We'll have to see. But when we look at the top 5 imports here into the United States, they're cars, used car parts. They are computer chips, laptops and phones. So these are things where the top, where we're, the countries we're importing them from, China, Mexico, and also petroleum, those are going to be felt, particularly around the oil, because oil feeds into so many of the different consumer products that are produced and transported across the country. So this time we may see some consumer pinch on prices. And that is why you've seen President Trump start to moderate his messaging just a little bit to say there won't be no impact, but you might feel a little bit of a ruffle on the prices. Again, I think he feels like American consumers, after 4 years of Biden inflation, are not as sensitive to the price increases under these new tariffs.
Elizabeth Mitchell, let me come back to you and the Department of Health and Human Services and the continued measles breakout that continues to rise. Is the Secretary of HHS doing enough? Should he talk more about vaccinations? Obviously, it is hitting a state like Texas pretty hard. Your thoughts?
Very sorry to hear about this measles outbreak. Of course, terrible to see that affecting families. I think that he did say he faced a lot of pushback throughout his confirmation about his past statements on vaccines, about people thinking that he is anti-vaccine. And I think he was able to put a lot of those concerns to rest, saying that he does encourage Americans to get their vaccinations. He's not going to tell people not to get vaccinations. He just wants people to have a choice. It's their decision and be able to have an informed decision to make on this.
Raynard, obviously, the American people will begin to feel the impact of these tariffs. Whether it has to do with smartphones, whether it has to do with the grocery stores like avocado and vegetables, they will feel the impact. But Americans feel they can endure. They believe that what the president is doing in the long run, they would benefit. And they also believe that he's finally placing Americans first. How long can his greatest asset, the American people, hold out before they break the dam?
Well, I don't think that's going to be a problem, Armstrong, because simply the American people see Trump taking decisive action in the interest of the American people, something we haven't seen under Democrat and Republican presidents in the past. And so I think the American people are going to bear with President Trump as long as possible. But also, Armstrong, I think there's a lot of misinformation on the economic data. The Atlanta, Georgia Federal Reserve came out with a report a couple of weeks ago that said under Trump's tariff regime, the price at the cash register will only increase on an average of 0.8% at the cash register. And if that's the case, that's negligible. You won't even feel it at the cash register. So I think there's a lot of misinformation being circulated among the media trying to scare the American people. The American people, Armstrong, they want to see a strong president who can go toe-to-toe with the media, live, unscripted, unannounced for 2 hours like President Trump has done. But they want to see, even if Trump gets punched in the face a few times, they give him credit for standing up and fighting for the American people, and that's been underestimated.
And we'll be back as Scott chuckles. We'll find out what that chuckle means when we return on this Saturday edition of the Armstrong-Williams Show.
It is easier to build up strong children than to try and repair broken men.
The streets are plagued with crime, violence. There's a lot of poverty, and it's all a result of lack of education that's happening in our schools. So it really is a crisis.
We come from very different political perspectives, but we've come to the same conclusion, and that is there is a crisis in the classroom. Children are being deprived of quality of life because they're being deprived of a good education. We must solve this problem. It's incumbent upon all of us to join hands together to get this done.
We can't afford to wait one more day before we address these issues, because every day we lose another child.
Let's stop the politicking. Let's stop the games. Let's really do something to give these kids a real chance at life and being a part of that American dream.
We need accountability for funding. Many of the districts where you're seeing very low test scores, students graduating with very low literacy and math comprehension rates, they are receiving a lot of funding. So where is the money going where our kids aren't being adequately educated?
If you believe every child is deserving of a quality education, please go to educationjusticefoundation.com. Andrew, what happens if President Trump comes for the mail? He said he's going to revamp the United States Postal Service, and I must admit, it is a nightmare delivering packages. I don't know if anyone on this panel or listening has been on the receiving end of USPS. There's a problem. But can Donald Trump, again, be all things to all agencies and all problems, Andrew?
No, he can't be. He can rhetorically, but things like the post office, this has been a problem for a long time, because remember, it's not just a government agency, it's a massive jobs program. You start talking about these jobs programs that they're going to cut from the VA or from the FDIC or pick whatever agency. The USPS is one of the largest. It's a lot of veterans. It's a lot of minorities. You start trimming that thing down, you're going to have a PR nightmare on your hands. The USPS has been a problem for multiple presidents for a long time. Everybody knows it's a fiscal issue for the United States government. Remember, it's a very unique part of the United States government where, by some measurements, it's as much as the second biggest department of government, but it's also partly its own corporation. This has been a sticky wicket for a lot of people. I doubt he solves it himself, but that briar patch, I'm not sure he's going to enjoy it as much as he thinks, because the rhetoric of it always sounds good, but anybody tries to wade in there, it always turns into a big old mess.
Patrice, the president again, in real time, just suspended tariffs on almost all products to Mexico until April 2nd. Wow, I'm telling you, you just can't keep up with Patricia. You just can't.
Well, I mean, I think there's been a lot of negotiations behind the scenes. We've heard from the Treasury Secretary and the Commerce Secretary, saying that they're negotiating behind the scenes, and they want to make sure that these tariffs actually don't go into effect if they don't have to. So it's not surprising. We'll continue to see the dates be pushed out and pushed out. I do think it's an interesting, my colleague here on the panel who referenced the Atlanta Federal Reserve report talking about the impact of the tariffs. If anything, it's the messaging on the tariffs. It is the media really reporting, what kind of impact it's going to have and driving the narrative that it's going to drive up prices significantly. I think that is what's going to have an emotional impact on consumers. If these tariffs do happen to go into effect, as I mentioned, a lot of the imports the top imports are around cars, phones, and maybe crude oil, which is probably the one that might have a longer reach. But a lot of these are things that we're importing are not necessarily things that people are buying right here and right away. That said, if the tariffs do really encourage other companies to bring their plants back into the United States and to support domestic production here, a lot of small businesses would be impacted, then that's going to be a very strong, credible message to a lot of Americans.
Scott Bolden, riddle me. The Attorney General, Pam Bondi, is facing heat from Trump allies, from the White House over the release of the Jeffrey Epstein files. Why?
It depends on, I haven't seen the list yet, but there's some pretty prominent names on that list, including Donald Trump, who was good friends with Epstein. But I'm a little surprised they're beefing because everything on a communication basis is being run through the White House. So the White House shouldn't be surprised since they are part of the decision-making process.
But there was nothing there. What they were expecting and what they built up was there was nothing there in the file, Scott.
Well, because that's what they released. So then what is the White House upset about? The fact that the DOJ and Bondi took a day of media? I'm not sure.
What are you upset, Raynard?
Well, number one, the story that no one's talking about, the FBI headquarters in New York City, the guy that
resigned.
He thought he was bigger than the Attorney General and the director of the FBI. So again, it shows you the deep state is basically trying to stymie the president's plans.
What's that got to do with the release of the Epstein documents?
Because he held on to 2,000
because they were
pages.
hyped. I think that the issue here is that Pam Bondi, the day before they were going to be released, she really hyped on Fox News show, one of the shows, that this was going to be monumental, that the names and the information that was going to be released was going to be surprising. And then when it was released, it was released to a handful of conservative social media folks. People saw, well, wait a minute, these are all names that we've seen before. Flight logs really didn't add anything new to the discussion, which makes us wonder, is there anything new to add? Or is it that person in New York who seems to be sitting on a lot more files, can you lean on them to be able to release more information? I think that's what President Trump was really upset with her.
That is correct.
Typing what ended up being not much new news.
That is correct. Elizabeth Mitchell, Donald Trump sent a message to Hamas this week. Release the remainder of those hostages or face, if I can be so bold, Armageddon.
I think it's, great to see that he's coming down hard on this terrorist organization. It is just unbelievable that these people have been held hostages for so long. We know that Hamas they said that they were releasing the body of a woman. They released the body of a different woman. There's been a lot of issues with this release, and Israel's been asking for it for a very long time. So good to see him sending a very strong message in this case.
Well, it looks like the U.S. is responding, but the U.S. is in direct discussions now with Hamas and Hamas representatives, which is completely a new approach. And America and Israel seem to be very comfortable with that. I'm not too comfortable with that because you need those Qatari mediators there who have a lot of credibility with Hamas and these other groups. But let's see. I mean, this president's leadership is all about marketing, communications, and rhetoric. No depth and substance, because a lot of things that he's promising and Americans like to hear, your 70%, of course, we will want that.
No, that's 70% are not all Republicans now.
No, I said Americans. I said across the board.
Okay,
I didn't say Republicans. Fair enough. And it sounds great, and it sounds like leadership, right? But when you peel the onion apart, when you peel the cover off, is there depth, substance, integrity, and credibility with what he's actually able to do?
Scott, hostages
it's a question. It's a question. Okay, prices aren't coming down. Hamas doesn't have to release those hostages.
They're doing it.
Whether they did it under a joint agreement, but this is phase 2.
Being dropped on them.
And that's not going to get the hostages released.
It's working.
It's working. It's not going to get the hostages released.
They're being released.
You just reported that Hamas hasn't released at least 4 that they promised, and we haven't moved into phase 2.
They released more than under Biden.
Well, they released more with Biden and Trump and Israel in those negotiations in December. Nobody's arguing about that.
They're terrified of Trump.
They can be terrified of Trump. All the hostages haven't been released. The mere fact that Trump is there and beating his chest doesn't mean...
the joint session of Congress the other night, sitting with our son who was held hostage.
His personal stories that night, his personal stories in that speech was his... I'm not minimizing it. I'm not Al Green. I applauded those personal stories because those personal stories made his speech much better. And there were a lot of Democrats that applauded those personal stories. And the young man who who was an honorary CIA person, or not CIA person, a Secret Service. And so you can't paint the Democrats with a broad brush on that. That was a powerful speech for Republicans, but the personal stories made the difference. And we've never seen Trump be that personal and that open and give that, let that light shine, if you will. So this president has very limited power. He's strong on the rhetoric, and you got the 70%, but in the end, give it 6 months. Right? Between DOGE, between programs being cut, between the terminations of these government agencies, majority of these government employees aren't in D.C. and the DMV. They're in red states and all over the country. Okay,
$36 trillion in debt.
Give it 6 months.
Well, Andrew, how do you respond to what you're hearing?
And we'll see whether they stick with Donald Trump or not.
Andrew.
Well, lot there. There's a couple things in here. Just go back to the Hamas thing real quick. Yeah, there's a moment here where you want to put maximum pressure on Hamas because the return of the dead baby parade thing was so bad that even the Qataris went back on that. Saudi Arabia had to issue a couple of official statements on it. If you could get the Qataris broke off so that they're not providing the umbrella cover for Hamas, that would be great. But I agree with our friend, the devil's in the details on this thing. If you're going to go to the nonsense about making Gaza into a real estate deal, that's not going to help anything. But is this the moment to put pressure on them, get these hostages back, and maybe break away the financial support, which is really the lifeblood to these terrorists? Yes, that is the thing. But it goes to everything else that just got discussed, too. The devil's in the details on these things. It's okay to tweet about it. It's okay to make a big public pronouncement. It's okay to get everybody reacting to it. But at some point, you got to do the detail stuff. You usually have to get some legislation involved in it. You got to get allies involved in it. That's the part that Donald Trump has suffered from in his first term, and we'll see how he does in this term. He can make the big pronouncements. Can he make something permanent past just what he said? They got.
Let me mention
real quick. You see this pushback from the judiciary. There are at least 10 federal decisions that are blocking DOGE.
They're doing their job.
And they're doing their job,
yes.
Right? But most Americans want this type of fraud, waste, and abuse to be terminated. But you cannot do it with a sledgehammer.
It's the process.
It's the process. Yes. It's got to be done legally. And you know what?
And you got to respect Congress.
Exactly.
Yes.
That's part of the illegality of it.
We agree. I want to say this before we go to break. Okay. I was at the president's speech on Tuesday night. I listened to it. I know when they're adding a little yeast. But when the president said that they were using money to see whether mice can become transgender, I just said that could not be true. And then the next day, CNN does a fact check to say it was true. I mean, just hearing that makes you cringe. Oh, what are these people thinking about, Raynard? Spending money on mice becoming transgender. It is crazy.
And that's what Trump and DOGE and Elon Musk are trying to address. You have these deep staters, career bureaucrats, who in many ways are arguing that they're more powerful than a sitting president of the United States. And their actions are indicative of that. They think they don't have to report to anyone.
Maybe, but the Republicans allocated the money for that study and the other studies that have been fraud. I'm not endorsing that, but don't blame the Democrats for that.
None of us want money on making mice transgender. Okay, let's go to break. None of us want that. That was crazy. Okay, and we'll be back.
There might be some value. value in it. Oh, please.
I don't know when I heard that. I didn't believe it. Yeah. I thought they made it up.
As a home buyer, you need a lender who cares about your home ownership dreams. United Security Financial has been helping families secure their dream homes for 30 years. We're a national fair practice lender that provides affordable mortgages and low down payment programs to eligible home buyers. To learn how United Security Financial can help you secure your dream home, call 1-800-373-4186.
Patricia, Ms. Onwuka, help us understanding this debanking of crypto. It seems that Trump and his allies is crypto all the time. What is it that we need to understand about crypto? Because it seems to be the new thing in this administration.
Well, I'm not the crypto expert, but from what I understand, certainly President Trump is committed to helping to shape a regulatory framework for cryptocurrency that won't stifle innovation and would kind of allow crypto to continue to balance. I think there's discussion about creating something like a Federal Reserve for crypto or a reserve for cryptocurrency for the United States. So it's saying, this idea of virtual currency or cryptocurrency, the United States needs to be a player here. How do we make sure that it can be protected? And certainly a lot of his supporters are investors in cryptocurrency, are very heavily involved in it. And so I think they're leaning there's some pressure here being applied to the Trump administration to be part of that conversation. Cryptocurrency, though, is very popular with lots of different demographic groups. For example, African Americans and Blacks in this country were some of the earliest adopters and people who have gotten into cryptocurrency, recognizing that it's in the future, it will be the way of banking and the way of really transacting. So it's interesting to see what's going to become of this. I will just say on the last segment, the waste, fraud, and abuse, when you look at Medicaid dollars, 1 in 5 Medicaid dollars are improper payments. And so we're talking about close to $1 trillion. It can be found and it can be cut out. And that's why DOGE is trying to get to the bottom of it.
Scott, the United States suspended those costly deportation flights using military aircraft.
They did what now?
They suspended the flights of deporting illegals using military aircraft. I just wanted to make a comment. But here's what I'd like to do for the remainder of the show, because we've been like Trump. We've been on fire since the beginning. Nobody's been able to take their breath. So we want to circle back and talk about...
Don't compare me to Donald Trump.
You're not flattered?
No, I'm not.
Okay. Well,
I believe in integrity and honesty.
Fake news, Scott. You're fake news.
So,
Right.
Elizabeth, what are you covering? What is your focus these days at the Daily Signal that we've not talked about?
Yeah, my focus these days is the White House. I've been going to every briefing, and yeah, definitely a really interesting briefing yesterday, reflecting on the State of the Union. As we've discussed, the large polling showing that people liked the speech on both sides of the political aisle for the most part. That was really interesting to see. There was, of course, a lot of talk at the briefing about the lack of positive response from the Democrats in Congress who were present, not much standing and clapping from them or the guests that were highlighted, but that was really a big topic of the briefing yesterday.
Scott, you mentioned something that Andrew said earlier when we were talking about the speech, but we moved so rapidly I didn't have a chance to come back to you. But even you said that it was a good speech.
If I was MAGA, if I was a Republican, and I believed everything he was saying, yeah, it was. From a delivery and presentation standpoint, and I give a lot of speeches just like you do, it was one of his best speeches. But as a Democrat and as an American citizen, I can't help but try to get behind the rhetoric and say, where is the substance, where is the truth? And there was a lot of hyperbole and a lot of untruths in that presentation and that statement.
Like what? You're struggling.
No, I'm not struggling. I'm saying what was untrue.
Tell us what was
untrue. DOGE, for example. DOGE is completely illegal. The savings that they've argued are not fraud, waste, and abuse. It's that the Republicans don't like those programs for the most part. Secondly, Article 3 courts have stymied and stopped DOGE because of its illegality. In regard to the shutting down of agencies and mass terminations, Article 3 courts have said no in at least 10 different decisions. And it may go to the Supreme Court, but even the Supreme Court said, you know, you've got to release billions of dollars they've committed under U.S. aid. You cannot shut down an agency. You cannot terminate people. You cannot gut these agencies without Congress weighing in. And Congress allocated the money for them, created these agencies, including DOE, and DOGE and Donald Trump, through executive orders, have no power and authority to do that.
But you just
which is why the courts are stopping them from doing this.
I want to come back to something Scott said, because he's right about this. I noticed the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Roberts, and Amy Coney Barrett at the president's Tuesday night speech, but they voted with the liberal left of the Supreme Court to stop him from firing some of these agencies and also from freezing the money.
That's right.
Andrew, so obviously I know the left would like to say that the conservative justices are in the tank with Donald Trump, but this is not the case. They're showing their independence and their jurisprudence, Andrew.
No, if you look over the history of the Supreme Court, despite the headlines, because we just pay attention mostly to the really big cases, things like 5-4 split decisions and the 9-0 unanimous decisions, those things sort of balance out over time. People are look, the Supreme Court's like a lot of things. People project whatever their priors are onto it and whatever their needs of the moment are onto it. The theme of the Roberts Court, whether you like Roberts, don't like him, good, bad, or indifferent, the theme of this court has been Congress needs to fix this, but the Supreme Court is in this situation where you have executive overreach, which has been a problem over various presidents of both parties, and they keep saying Congress needs to fix it, and Congress never fixes it, and then people are wondering, well, why doesn't the Supreme Court fix it, when they very clearly said, correctly by the law, no, Congress is supposed to fix this, and that's kind of the core problem to a lot of our government stuff that you can get to. The Supreme Court gets all the blame for that, but really this is a congressional problem more than anything. They're just the ones kind of left with the dustpan when they can't clean it all up nice and neat.
You know, I cannot emphasize enough on today's broadcast that Donald Trump has rescinded himself on the tariffs against Canada and Mexico, and the new deadline date now is April 2nd. At least he's willing to change as the negotiations progress. The thing I wanted to mention to you, when we talk about the federal government and the people that are being fired and terminated, thousands of those jobs have gone to veterans who've returned from wars, from service to serve in the government. Many of them are being terminated.
Well, listen, we have a $36 trillion budget deficit, so there can be no sacred cows. But here's the thing that tells me President Trump is winning. If you get a radical liberal like A. Scott Bolden...
Radical?
Please don't label me like that.
Yeah,
you know that's not true. Don't label me like that.
He's not radical.
If you get him... did you hear what he just conceded earlier in this show? He's no longer arguing about what DOGE is finding as far as money. He's arguing about the amount. That's a tectonic shift from admitting that there is waste and abuse.
Well, he admitted there was waste. He admitted that.
Admitted
but now
that
we're
earlier.
arguing about the amount. That's a tectonic shift from a communication
My earlier
perspective.
comment was clearly about whether there's fraud, waste, and abuse, and the line of demarcation between whether you politically like a program or not. These funds have been allocated by Republicans and Democrats. But there's one thing that we haven't talked about, real quick. There's one thing we haven't talked about. Donald Trump keeps putting off these tariffs, right? Because he's trying to compel compliance, because he knows he's going to throw us into a tariff war with our friends like Canada and Mexico. And you see that the tariffs against China are much lower than the tariffs against our friends. And so look at the stock market. The stock market the last 2 days has lost 1,200 points. Now, it recovered yesterday, I think, but the reason he's playing these tariffs, he's trying to get compliance, but he knows the downside of this tariff war is going to be higher prices, one, and two, make it more expensive for us to even do business with our friends. Now, tariffs may work. Let me tell you the only reason tariffs work. If you can produce everything that you import in the U.S., he's trying to get there. but tariffs isn't the way to get there because he doesn't have the resources and the technology and the items or the ability to produce it in the interim. That's why the argument about him being bringing back a strong economy is a false argument. But he's making it more expensive for us.
But you're saying there's a possibility that it could work. Patrice, let me get your comments on what's got.
He can produce in the U.S. now.
Go ahead, Patrice.
First off, I'm glad to hear Democrats care about the cost of life today, because for the past 4 years, we were lied to and told that inflation wasn't happening and that prices weren't a big deal. And then we were also lied to when they were willing to admit it and say that, oh, this is about price gouging and greedy corporations, when that's not the case. Will there be an impact on prices? I think that remains to be seen, especially if the tariffs are not going into effect. The larger economy, though, we are seeing that for example, the labor market, I think there's some weakness in hiring. What companies need to hire more, and what we need to see economic growth really stimulate, is the tax cuts. And that's actually what I've been working on a lot at Independent Women's Forum, which is talking about the fact that if Congress does not act to extend the 2017 Trump tax cuts, the average American will see their taxes raised 22%. We're talking about the median family seeing their tax increase of over $1,600. Small businesses will see their tax rates jump up to 43%. And so we can bicker over, DOGE and spending cuts, and all of that is important, and it's part of the the budget resolution process. But if we don't see taxes, that is tax cuts extended, that's going to have a huge rippling impact across the rest of the economy. And so I think that's what President Trump is leaning on Republicans to really push forward with, and for Senate Republicans to get online with what the House Republicans are passing. If that does not happen, then I think you would see a lot more economic turmoil.
But let's not be disingenuous about it. I'm not suggesting you are. I just completely disagree, because those tax cuts from 8 years ago or 6 years ago provided no tax relief for poor people, working class, or the middle class.
That is a lie, sir. That is a lie,
listen,
sir.
ma'am, I don't lie and I don't call names, so please don't do it to me.
But
I said that that's not true.
The majority of those tax cuts were for corporations and the wealthy, in the middle of and after a COVID economy. And so if you pass those tax cuts again, and there's empirical data to support this, that the most tax relief that Americans get out of that tax package is going to go to the rich and corporations. That's undeniable.
But first off, the 2017 tax cuts were before the pandemic. So I think folks remember that they were enacted in 2018. The pandemic didn't hit till 2020. So let's correct that. Number two, when we look at the corporate tax rate, that dropped down to 21%. Corporations pass that on to their workers in higher pay, bonuses, benefits. We're talking about CVS to Lowe's to all small corporations across the country. So there was a direct impact on workers in their pay, in their benefits.
So you are agreeing
on
the jobs.
You have the greatest job growth.
It is
We
not
have the history of this country under Biden. You have the greatest job growth. Without a doubt. Who are you waving at? Me?
We're good. Thank you, everybody. We're done here. Enjoy the rest of your weekend. We're out of here. Okay? I love it, though. I do love it.